Welcome to the Great Awakening Podcast. I'm your host, Josh Dawes. Today's episode, we are going to be talking all about how do we do ministry and politics in a post-Christian culture that is growing increasingly hostile to the things of God. My guest is James Wood. He is an associate editor at First Things Magazine, where he created a bit of a stir recently on evangelical Twitter with his article entitled How I Evolved on Tim Keller, where he really raises some concerns with what James calls a winsome third-way model of ministry. And we'll get into that in the conversation, what that means. And really, it sparked a lot of really, I think, fruitful discourse on how we should be thinking about ministry, politics, and the winsome strategy that it was really pioneered by guys like Tim Keller. So it's a great conversation. I'm really excited to share it with you guys. But first, I'd love to tell you about our sponsor, which is Gold River Trading Company. Gold River Trading Company is a tea company. They sell an assortment of teas. Right now, I am drinking their peppermint green tea, which is really great. I've got a bit of a stuffy nose, and so it's opening up the nasal passages nicely, and it's very, very good, high quality tea. But the great thing about Gold River Trading Company is that they are a company that shares our values. They know that you've got a lot of options when it comes to spending your beverage money, but it would be nice if there's you don't have to you had an option not to spend your money with a woke company that is going to spend their profits promoting things that don't align with our values. And that's where Gold River has stepped in and said, no, we're a company that shares your conservative Christian values, and we're not going to promote any of the stuff that some of these other beverage companies are behind. And so that's why I'm thrilled to partner with them. For our listeners, they do have a discount code where you can get 10% off your order. That is, if you go to their website, which is goldriverco.com. That's goldriverco.com, and enter the coupon code AWAKENING. You can get 10% off of your order. So definitely go over there, show them some support, and really put your money into companies that are supporting our values. So with that, let's jump right into our conversation with James. Hi, James. Thanks for coming on the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
All right. So you have been the man of the hour the last couple of weeks because of an article you wrote for First Things. And can you tell us the title of that article, what it was about?
Yeah. The article, I guess it came out on May 6th, was How I Evolved on Tim Keller. And what it was about, I guess I could tell you kind of how it originated, and then maybe provide a very brief summary of the points, and we can analyze any of those points further if we so wish. But yeah, I mean, there are assumptions that people have made about the origin of this, that, maybe I'm trying to make a name for myself or something like that, and taking down a great man. And I very much don't want to do that. I'm still pretty shocked about the response to it, which we'll, I guess, get into. But where it originated was I was sitting down with Rusty Reno one day, who's the head editor of First Things, which is where I've been working, and just kind of sharing some of my background. And my background is that I've been very influenced by Tim Keller. And I came to faith in 2004 while I was a student at the University of Texas in Austin through a campus ministry that was very much influenced by the Keller model of ministry, the missional winsome model in a sense. And then I started to really articulate and think through my faith through his terms, particularly the arguments that he developed in things like prodigal God, which kind of became a cornerstone to his whole ministry, and how that helped understand the gospel, but then also how to reach your neighbors and live a life of mission. And I got really excited about that, and came on staff with that ministry, and then eventually became the campus director for that team, and was there for total 6 years. And I would always use Tim Keller. I mean, people on our staff team would get annoyed with how often I'd be like, well, Tim Keller puts it this way. And then almost every talk I would give, I would pay for the sermons from the Redeemer website, but I definitely would steal a lot of points. And people, once they got to know me, they're like, oh, it sounds very much like Tim Keller. I'm like, I'm not hiding that. So anyway, so he's meant a lot to me.
And
so much
your
so,
dog's named Keller.
so much so that we named our dog, my wife
Right.
and I. We fell in love really over discussing ministry and particularly some of the ideas that were in Reason for God when it came out in 2008, which is when we were dating. And it really inspired a life just for us, envisioning a life of ministry, reaching out to our neighbors. And then actually, I shared, I gave my groomsmen all Prodigal God because it had just come out around the wedding. But we did name our dog Keller. And I was telling Rusty this, and because I was also articulating Rusty how I had shifted a little bit, like I no longer am looking for him for certain reasons, which we can talk about. But I told him we named our dog Keller. And then Rusty looked at me and said, "You must write an essay about this and start with that." So that's where it came from. And I wrote it about 3 months ago. It's just been sitting in the hopper. And I think they were looking for an opportune time to publish it. And then I think when that famous thread now about abortion came out, right, and unfortunately for Keller, came out right before the Dobbs leak, and then kind of sparked a whole conversation about that. That's when they released it. So yeah, and I'll just very briefly kind of 2 points of what I argued, and then we can kind of dig in further. Is in that first essay, which I had a follow-up essay, but in the first essay at First Things, I basically argued 2 things. That one, Keller's winsome third-way framework, which we can discuss, I've argued was much more suited for a previous era in American life, and is less so now in a moment in which our society is increasingly moved away from God and a moral consensus premised on something like natural law, and has become increasingly hostile to any attempt to shape social and political order according to Christian moral principles. So that's the first point. And then secondly, I argued that Keller and his acolytes tend to approach, this is kind of one of my other main arguments, approach politics and cultural engagement over contentious issues through the lens of evangelism and apologetics. And as I've developed in the follow-up piece, I really have articulated, kind of refined my thoughts there. That I think that actually that approach is always wrong for various reasons. So those are the 2 main points. Oh, and then I would say one last thing before I forget. Another reason why I wrote the article, which I said in the follow-up piece, is I was trying to defend Keller against his harshest critics. I've just been in so many conversations over the past couple of years, which has really been shocking to me, of a lot of people who've had a similar journey of mine, of being a former fanboy and then increasingly kind of shifting elsewhere. But a lot of people are a lot more disappointed and angry at him. And I think make a lot of baseless accusations, that he's some
Yeah.
closet Marxist, closet liberal, undermining the church. I think all that's silly. I think there are legitimate critiques to make, but I think they need to be made in a much clearer way that also raises the discourse beyond those kind of ad hominems. And so I was trying to give voice to some of those concerns, but in such a way that the discourse was raised for providing some constructive terms we can build on. So
Yeah. And I think you did that beautifully. It was very much a model for how these sorts of critiques should be raised, because it was very respectful. I was shocked at some of the responses, particularly David French just blasted you in his Sunday essay, which I thought was completely uncalled for. And I was scratching my, did you read the same thing I read? But yeah, I think it's a testament to just how winsome, for lack of a better term, your critique was, that we're still talking about it here several weeks on. It's just, it has, I think, it perfectly articulated a lot of the things that maybe some of the other critiques were getting at, but didn't know quite how to, articulate.
yeah, thanks. Yeah, I was surprised. I don't want to talk about David French too much, but I was surprised to wake up on Sunday morning and find out that I was the face of the moral devolution of the nasty new right. I do know people on the nasty new right, and I think they would be pretty unimpressed that I was their face. So anyway, yeah, I definitely don't want to, and we can get into, I know we have other questions on that point, but I'm not advocating for a lot of the things that I think are being accused. But
Yeah, and so you had the initial article, and then after the reaction, you kind of expanded on that in a second a follow-up that was creatively titled, this article is not about Tim Keller, or something like that, which I think gets to more of the critique of the model itself. So how would you describe that ministry model, that kind of went some third-wayism?
Yeah. Um, yeah. Let me I'm going to probably read a couple things so I don't make sure I have my train of thought here. Yeah, and I would say that I'm not critiquing either. So there's two key phrases that I critiqued: winsomeness and third-wayism, and kind of combine them in a package. And I'm actually not absolutely opposed to either of those in every sense. But those two terms kind of, I think, are helpful to kind of encapsulate what the Keller model is, according to me. And so, what are my critiques of winsomeness? Um, well, really, what I'm referring to is kind of a package approach to cultural engagement that seeks, above all, to minimize offense so as to maximize openness to the gospel. Usually, cashes out trying to show the reasonableness of Christianity, and how it's not so strange, and also and trying to distance against some of the kind of less respectable parts of the Christian faith, particularly like trying to show we're not fundamentalists, right? Um, and I often think that winsomeness can translate into niceness, which I think can be problematic. And look, I'm not advocating for abandoning the biblical imperatives of treating others with gentleness and respect, loving our neighbors, even our enemies, to avoid quarreling or to seek peace with all as much as possible. What I'm trying to say is that in our increasingly post Christian culture, truthful love will be met with more hostility and will often be called unloving and unwinsome. And if you're overly orienting yourself by how your actions are received, I think you're setting yourself up in a problematic way. And I think there's a danger that you'll increasingly, if even your very nice, winsome way of articulating core truths of the faith, particularly on social morality, are always met with harsh opposition, I think it'll be easy for you to be tempted to think that actually those convictions themselves are the problem.
Mhm.
But I don't want to. I'm not advocating for nastiness and retaliation, but for resilience, courage, and clarity. So,
Yeah.
so
I
that's on the
think
winsome. Go ahead.
I think I saw someone suggest a distinction between a winsome strategy and a winsome demeanor. Of course, we
Hmm.
want to have a winsome demeanor
Yeah,
in our interactions with people, but the the winsome strategy that we've been employing might not be best for our
yeah.
current culture.
And if I thought that we should be nasty, I would have been nasty in my pieces, which I, I hope
Yep.
it's clear I tried to avoid that. So that's on winsomeness, and I'll just summarize third way really quick, and then we can keep going. But I believe still in some of the core points of third wayism, which I even did try to articulate in both pieces. I think the good here is that it's attempting to avoid political tribalism and uncritical partisanship. The assumption that one party has everything right according to the biblical vision, and trying to create some sort of emotional or existential distance from overly identifying with a particular party or movement. I think that's right. I think it's also trying to avoid divisions between Christians who come to different conclusions over prudential judgments and politics within the bounds of moral orthodoxy.
Right.
And I think it's also trying to not make those practical disagreements a stumbling block to the gospel witness. My critique is that it can easily lead into a couple errors: false moral equivalencies, disdain towards fellow Christians, usually to your right, is how it seems to translate. And I think it creates a bad logic as it pertains to politics. And so that's and I kind of can expand on that as we go on, but I articulate those in the pieces. So
Yeah. I think I have a similar journey as you, I think, because I was very much I was really into the seeker sensitive movement. My father was a pastor, Southern Baptist. Grew up in the height of purity culture and all of the things that, a lot of kind of evangelical elites are embarrassed about today.
mm-hmm.
And, once I hit college and discovered a seeker sensitive church, I was all in. I thought, oh, this is great. Finally, a church that I can invite my friends to and I don't have to be embarrassed. And just this whole, idea of trying to make the gospel as least, as just throw off anything that is unnecessarily offensive.
Mm-hmm.
And I think where that being enamored with that model started to really fade for me was after the 2016 election.
Mm-hmm.
And just seeing, all these years of trying to prove, oh, we're not like those Christians over there. We're,
Yep.
we're winsome, we're different. We're, you could have a beer with us. We're awesome. um, then after, white evangelicals voted for Trump,
Yep.
which I was strongly never Trump for winsome reasons
Yep. Me too.
in 2016. I just saw all of this hatred. We
Yep.
were living in Los Angeles at the time, and just all of my leftist liberal friends, were just so incensed at the, white evangelicals. And I'm like, I know the people back home. I know that was a hard decision for them. It wasn't, not all of them were like gung ho, yes, this is our guy. It was a difficult moral, calculation that they had to make to further the goal of ending abortion. Was really the big thing,
Yep.
thinking that he would do pro-life judges. And just seeing that that hatred and kind of all those winsome wins just evaporate overnight, it kind of signaled that we're in a new world. This is,
Mhm.
it doesn't matter how winsome we are. If we
Mhm.
take any sort of biblical, principled stands for biblical justice, we're going to be hated.
Yep.
And it started to, I don't know, lose its luster at that point.
Yeah. Can I make 3 quick points to that I was
Yeah.
thinking of? Is one, okay. I think Keller's framework, and I'd have to look at some data. It'd be an interesting research project here. Keller's approach, I think, was very good at reaching. I think there are people who came to Christ for the first time, sure, according to Keller's model and how ministers appropriate that. But I wonder if it was more effective less for the unchurched than the dechurched people
Mhm.
who, you know, left kind of red areas, rural areas, ended up in some cities, blue areas, no longer wanted to be associated with what these less reputable aspects of the faith, and wanted to find a way to stay in the church and maintain some moral orthodoxy with credibility. And I wonder if that was a major draw. And so you get the de-churched that way, in a certain respect, or the hesitant to still associate with Christianity, and now this enables them to do so. But I wonder if that inclines you. There's a problematic temptation there, where you continuing to distance from and differentiate yourself from other believers. And for me, and I shared this in the Spaces event last night, I've always had a built-in reaction to some of that kind of stuff. Um, for 2 reasons that were related to my time as a campus minister at a secular university. Is one, I always grade against. I do just have a grade against elitism, though I know I'm in elite circles. I'm not saying that. I'm not denying the certain circles that I inhabit, but I grade against like this idea that you get these certain type of figures and then you get everybody else. And um, my my reading the Bible didn't confirm that to me. You don't avoid, if God gives you the opportunity to reach those people, that's great. But so I always kind of graded against that. And also, I don't come from that. I come from a very, very poor family. And I'm the first person in my family to go to college, all these things. I could go down that road. But maybe even just my own background makes me grade against it. But the other thing is, when I was a minister, I was at this liberal university, University of Texas in Austin. And those types of universities tend to draw these really kind of crazy missionaries, these crazy evangelists, street evangelists. And that is not what I did as a campus evangelist. And I think that those things are wrong. But we'd always have this dilemma when those people would come and they would do kind of hellfire and brimstone things, which I don't agree with. But our students would be really distraught and be like, they'd come to me as a campus pastor and be like, what do you think about this stuff? Like, oh gosh, and I would always have to really work hard to check my heart to not just immediately be like, oh, we're so much better than them. Those are the bad Christians. We're not like those bad Christians. Because I had fallen in love with the vision of the church and Christian unity at that time, and the brotherhood of believers. And I want to be very reticent to just dump on fellow Christians, even if it might make things difficult for me. And so, and because I was just inspired also by Paul's teaching, like, look, whatever motives these people are preaching Christ is preached, right? And so that, anyway, so then when I see things like, the 2016 election, I was a never Trumper as well for public witness reasons, just like you probably, and like, gosh, it's going to harm our witness. But what I saw was exactly what you saw, is like, my heart was hardened towards my fellow Christians, who were making prudential judgments for whatever reasons. And I really started to get really discouraged by how other Christians were adopting kind of the secular media narrative about these people
Mhm.
and leading them to hate other Christians who, and I just knew too many Christians who voted for Trump for really thoughtful reasons, who weren't just trying to claim back the culture and impose religion on society, but yeah, like the judges or something. And I was like, look, I know these people, these are good people. And so I think then it started to pivot me as like, is there something off in my framework?
Mhm.
And so, yeah, probably similar to you. And I articulated that in the pieces.
Yeah, I began to notice in my heart that I was looking at other believers as obstacles
Yeah.
to my, evangelism.
Hmm.
And it's like I almost think that we become, or at least in my heart, I had become so invested in the ministry model and the strategy of winsome public witness that um, yeah, it turned other believers into obstacles that I had to run down. I had to kind of throw under the bus in order to keep, my winsome project,
Hmm.
moving forward.
Yeah, and a major verse for me. So my all my research and writing is actually less directly about this type of politics. I'm usually talking about the church. I've published a lot on the church and how we should focus our social imagination within the church itself as a primary political life, in a sense. So I don't usually write about these things, but that actually has helped me think through this stuff because one of the things that really motivates my imagination uh, is Jesus in John 13, right? Like this is how the world you're my disciples is what how you love each other. And if we're doing public witness by dumping on other Christians as like one of our primary gut reflexes, it's just hard for me to view that as actually being faithful to the model that Jesus prescribes to us. Yes, love can look like rebuke, but it needs to be much more personalized, right? In a relational context rather than just like blanket denunciations of entire groups of Christians in the public sphere. Like that to me, how is the world going to know that we're his disciples by loving each other that way? Just I don't think that fits. So,
Yeah, yeah, and I think as you talked about in your piece, that culture has changed so much just in the last 4 years that and a lot of this is talked about in Aaron Renn's three worlds model that we're firmly in negative world now, and there's some debate over like when did that start and hasn't the world always been negative? But I think it's a helpful framework for discussing this because I think when we were in neutral world, there was a bit of a shared culture that you could talk about contextualizing the gospel to the culture because we all, right and left, kind of shared a common American culture. If we're talking just purely in the context of America, um, that maybe now we don't have. And so when you talk about contextualizing the gospel for the culture, you have to pick like which specific subculture are you targeting? And
mm-hmm.
by that very choice, you're therefore excluding other cultures. Like we're not going after the Trump deplorables so that we
Mm-hmm.
can win the progressive urban elite.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Yeah,
wonder, yeah, go ahead.
yeah, and I think that just and if you do that in like a universalistic way, like maybe or maybe Keller was right to do some of that. I mean, and I think that's still contestable. We can say that there still might have been problems with that, right? But maybe there was something right about that in Manhattan. But the problem is that Keller's influence on a ministry imagination is so massive on so many ministers that they were taking that and universalizing it
Mhm.
in so much of America. And so you're going to go to some, more red areas or something, and it's easy for those people to feel like you're constantly condescending to them, and that's also just gonna backfire long term. I mean, you know, we could do just tons of analysis, and I don't want to do tons of analysis on the Trump phenomenon in this conversation, but you could do like, how did he emerge, right? Like, if people keep getting pushed into a corner and saying they're horrible, you're probably not going to animate the best impulses from them. That doesn't excuse any actions of anybody in that sort of occasion, but there's something that makes sense there. And so also like okay, just the Keller model of so contextualizing to a particular group of people in a way that you push aside or even quickly denounce another set of people. I think it'll backfire. So yeah, and then the shared moral culture. I mean, I do think there was more of that that we've lost. I mean, a lot of people have talked about this before Ren, right? Like Zygmunt Bauman's on like liquid modernity and all of that. Like we're just, dissipating, our culture's dissipating so much. And so there's that. And I think also like so much, people may have critiques of Ren's particular framing, but like the whole like post-Christendom discussion has preceded him for many years. And maybe he's identifying just one stage of it, right? And there's something different about being in a post-Christian culture than in a pre-Christian culture. Lots of people have written on this. This is, and that does change things a little bit. And what I think Ren and others are articulating in the last, 7 years or not 8 years or so, is it does seem to be there's been an accelerated shift towards not just necessarily having hostility towards Christian persons, but actually having increasing hostility towards Christian ideals to shape the social order. Like that, and you see that in things like, and I mentioned this in the American Reformer piece just as one little signal of this, like the real rise in denunciations of Christian nationalism. I know there's something out there called Christian nationalism that is troubling, and we need to critique that when we see it. And I really do. If you follow me on Twitter, you'll see when I see something, I'm like, ooh, that's not good. But oftentimes what goes under that label is just like any conservative Christian influence in politics.
Right.
And so, and that's just a sign of me of like, things have really shifted. If just kind of standard bog Christian influence, conservative Christian influence in politics is now denounced as really dangerous Christian nationalism, that shows a shift that Ren has tried to put some language on.
Yeah.
And I think that, and one more thing is, I think we have to think about that. How does that shift things, right? And one of I think the silliest critiques, there have been some critiques that I've thought through deeply, but I think one of the ones I've just dismissed out of hand that did seem to pop up in a lot of places, and I think you've been flagging this on Twitter, right, is these people who critiqued the argument of like, hey, maybe we need to try a different approach by saying, well, isn't this just pure pragmatism? Like the gospel doesn't change, the biblical imperatives don't change or whatever. Isn't this just pragmatism? I'm like, it's fascinating to me that an argument about contextualization is being denounced by the defenders of the great master of contextualization. I mean, Tim Keller taught me more about contextualization than anybody.
Right.
And so I find that those arguments a little silly, but.
Yeah. I mean, just in the wake of this, I started reading Center Church just to make sure I actually understand, what Keller's model looks like. And it's fascinating just how much, of that opening introduction, he's talking about the need to constantly reevaluate the context for, our gospel presentation for the context and historical moment you're in.
Yeah.
And so it just seems, it's crazy to think that, Tim Keller, discovered the one right true model for always, that we can't touch it now. When I don't even think Tim Keller would agree with that.
Yeah. Yeah. And who knows how much of his tweets currently are his. And I'd be, I'd love to, I'm sure we'd have a great time sitting over a beer or coffee or something, talking about these things. And I think he would concede some of that, right? Like that's, and I think he's trying maybe in some ways to even acknowledge this himself, but it's his defenders, which I think are really pushing against it in a little bit unreasonable ways. I think I don't think Keller ever thought, or I hope not, that his approach was the final universal approach for ministry, because that would seem to really go against his own teachings in my reading of them.
Yeah, and so in your argument, you focus a lot on the political implications. I think there's it can be applied in a much broader sense, and I think we need to spend some time thinking about how is this model impacted just a whole range of how we think about just ministry. I think someone in the Twitter Spaces brought up faithful presence. Yeah. And thinking, I was spending some time this morning thinking through how this winsome model has robbed that faithful presence of any real power, because we see our work as an evangelistic, primarily through an evangelistic lens. So when we're in those spaces where we can make decisions to steer our company towards the good and away from the wicked, we don't want to stick our neck out and say something hard that's going to, be seen as unloving or uncaring because that might hurt our witness. And so we have to I think we really need to be thinking about why are we at work? Is it purely we're just supposed to be an evangelical witness there? Or is there additional responsibility we have as Christians in these secular spaces?
Yeah, and to give Keller credit, which it's not that you're not saying this, but maybe one of the things that's worth flagging that he's done is I do think he's a great evangelist. I mean, that animates him, but I think he also has been really thoughtful about like cultural creation, faith and work stuff apart from merely evangelism. But I think, you're right that it's more the winsome frame there of really reticent to offend that I think can get you in some danger, right? And so the whole faithful presence, which is another, that's James Davison Hunter's phrase, which his book is really, really good. I read it the day it came out. I pre-ordered it. I remember, but I can't remember what year that was, and was really moved by it in a lot of ways. I have some critiques of it now. But a lot of people who appropriate that term and that framework have been serious failures, I think, in the spaces that they inhabit. Meg Basham, I draw attention to her. Her recent expose piece about the pandemic stuff is really important work, and those would be people that she discusses in that essay, that reporting, who would identify with the faithful presence model. And yet there's a lot of presence, and there's a little bit less faithfulness than I think we would want. And then you have to ask the question, well, why is that? And I wonder if you're overly concerned about minimizing offense, I think that that will slide you in that direction.
Yeah. I remember celebrating certain actors who were kind of undercover Christians in Hollywood, and you see some of the roles they're taking, and like, okay, that's a compromise now so that they can use their influence later. And you keep waiting, like, when are they going to use that influence?
That's right. Yeah.
When is the faithful presence kick in?
Well, there's a bunch of things like that, right? I mean, you could look at it from a couple analogs to that, right? Well, you could even look at it in an interesting political angle of like revolution. Like one of the reasons why conservatives generally resist they're reticent on revolutions is because it's hard to be a conservative once you've used revolutionary methods, because you've already become kind of anti-conservative in that regard. And you've kind of set up a trajectory, right? But in another way, like just evangelism, the whole friendship evangelism or relational evangelism model, which I still think is probably better than the flyby street preaching, for sure. But one of the temptations there, right, is you kind of say that you're building a relationship to eventually share the gospel, and then you end up never doing it.
Yeah.
And there's this great clip, great clip by Penn and Teller, one of the guys in that, right, that evangelists have used forever and in meetings and stuff, is the atheist comedian talked about this Gideon guy who came up to him after one of his shows, and he uses a lot of profanities, an atheist, and this guy said, "Hey man, it was a great show," and handed him he's like, "Hey, I don't know if you believe in it, ever thought this," handed him a Gideon Bible, whatever, and it's kind of this awkward thing. But what Penn or Teller, whatever, whoever it was, said afterwards is like, "Man, but that was genuine." And he said, I've always told Christians, how much do you have to hate me to not tell me about the Jesus that you so believe I need? And it's always been a challenge, right? And so it's the same thing with, there's a similar analog here of faithful presence is, do we really believe these things are important? And if we're hiding it for too long, that's going to already signal that we don't think they're that important.
Yeah.
And you're already kind of setting yourself up to mute those things indefinitely. And so you're asking, like, where else does apply discipleship or evangelism and discipleship, right? I mean, like, what, like, you've quoted a couple times, I've heard the Tozer quote, like, we used to use that in ministry as well. What you win people with is what you win them to. And so if you really have a reduced kind of call, if you really reduce the call rather than come and die, right? Take up your cross and follow me. If you really you reduce that, then it's going to be hard in discipleship to then bring up those hard teachings. And so there's that. But then also one of my big concerns is pastoral protection of the flock as well in this. And I do think some of this model uh, the winsome kind of third way model doesn't set you up well to protect the flock from wolves. And so
Mm.
Kevin DeYoung had a great little short piece in response to all this, and he's been very kind. We've corresponded a little bit in this affair, and he had a great little piece on world, kind of setting up some principles. And he used two juxtaposing principles that I thought were really helpful. Of we need to build bridges with the world, and we need to build, but also build fences to protect the sheep.
Mm.
And and um, a- and I think that this model can oftentimes neglect that part where because you're so reasonable and nuanced, and you don't want to appear unreasonable or unthoughtful, you can let certain things into the church that really have destructive corrosive force.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, I think about like John Piper when he did the tweet heard around the world, farewell Rob Bell.
which some people
Yeah.
have compared my piece about Tim Keller to that, and I'm like, no.
Oh, no, I don't think that's a fair comparison. But yeah, that the reaction to that was just like, oh, how horrible, for
Yeah.
for Pastor Piper to do that. And I think, I don't know, there's so many influences on the church to just, I don't know, neglect that protective duty is, I talked about this on the last episode with Abigail Dodds, just how we're all swimming in culture. And
Yeah.
to think that we're not being influenced is just, I don't know, it's just ridiculous. And I think too about, going back to the faithful present, how often, you see people in those positions that, I'm sure begin with the intention of I'm going to be an influence here, end up being influenced by the world, and the
Mhm.
world is doing, better evangelism than we're doing.
Yeah. I mean, I forget the exact. I don't have it committed to memory, but there's a famous quote, right, of like the church is supposed to go into the world, but oftentimes we're letting the world into the church, right? And we need to be thought of it. The church world binary is hard to articulate. I mean, it's very complicated in the biblical vision and throughout Christian history and theology, but there is a distinction, and we need to maintain it. I shared this quote, and let me just read it again last night because I find so one of the reasons I've been drawn to study some Catholic theologians is not because I'm on the sliding towards Catholicism, but because it's refreshing to get other resources to address some of the conversations that we're having,
Mhm.
and to escape like, okay, you're just a left or right American person, or you're a fundamentalist against the evangelicals or something like that. No, like other groups are having some of these conversations, but they're using different terms. And Hans Urs von Balthasar said this about some of these secular ideologies and how we need to guard ourselves against them, permitting them in the church. He says, some things like Marxism or other forms of secular humanism, he says, they're like an alien wasp that injects its anesthetizing sting and lays its egg right inside the Christian organism, with the result that the body, hollowed out from the inside, serves as welcome food for the enemy. And I've just like I've read, I wrote a paper on Balthasar publication, and I just found him really sharp on these things. And so, but if you said that, as a Protestant American, it's just like, oh, you're just being narrow-minded fundamentalist. But he's like, no,
Yeah.
we need to resist the being colonized by hostile ideologies.
Mhm.
And we need to really put up our guard against some of those things. And I'll share one more framework that I've found helpful. Joe Rigney has used this, and I think this is a really helpful conceptual tool. I don't know where he learned it from, if he didn't found it himself, created himself. But he says, yes, as Christians, we need to build bridges and embrace refugees from the world, but not apostles from the world.
Mhm.
So people who are coming to the church broken and trying to turn away from the world, absolutely. But if we're embracing with open arms people who are trying to change the church to look like the world, the shepherds need to protect the sheep from that.
Yeah. And it's, I get why shepherds are so reluctant to do that, because you have to make a judgment call. You have
Yep.
to at some point say, no, this person is not just a false teacher or someone who's being misled. This person is a wolf that is actively leading people astray. And that
Mhm.
goes right against that whole winsome
Yeah, because then
model.
what will you be accused of? You'll be accused of the biblical imperatives that you're being quarrelsome, you're being
Yep.
combative, right? I mean, or are you protecting the sheep from wolves? I mean, and so that's why it's like my critique of often like the winsome framework. It's a blunt because the way that these biblical imperatives get applied is in a very blunt, absolute way,
Hmm.
without due sensitivity to different audiences and contexts, and then how you play up other parts of the biblical vision as well. So
Yeah. Yeah. I was reading in Ephesians this week, and got to the or Galatians, whichever one has the fruits of the Spirit, and reading the fruits of the Spirit, and then just a few verses before that, Paul says, I wish that these people who are leading you astray would emasculate themselves. And it's like, wait a minute.
yeah, let me read oh man, I don't have it here, but let me see if I can find it. I might have got it right here. Oh, no, I don't. My friend, oh, here it is. My friend posted a list of phrases that the Bible uses towards false teachers. And just let me listen to this. So Jesus on false teachers calls them liars, antichrists, deceivers, commanded the churches to refuse hospitality to them. They're wolves in sheep's clothing, blind guides, children of hell, sons of the devil, whitewashed tombs. Peter said about false teachers, they're irrational animals, creatures born to be caught and destroyed, blots and blemishes, accursed children, waterless springs, wind-driven mists, dogs who return to their own vomit. Paul said about false teachers, they are accursed. Their teaching spread like gangrene. They must be silenced. They should castrate themselves. John, about false teachers, calls them liars, antichrist, deceivers, and commanded the churches to refuse hospitality. So it's just like, look, like that doesn't sound very winsome,
Hmm.
but it's just all over the Bible. And so Matt Kennedy was the one who put those lists together, and I found them really, really, really helpful. So
Yeah. Yeah. I think that gets us to the discipleship piece of this. I
yeah.
think, we were talking earlier today on DM for a bit. In my experience in seeker sensitive churches that I've been a part of, there was this idea that the Sunday morning is going to be very evangelical, evangelistic.
Mm-hmm.
This is a space where we bring in outsiders and they can get a taste of the gospel. And then you have other environments that are kind of that next step um, into like, the first step into spiritual formation. And then you would have these, more intimate, groups, the small group environment that is really about believers, growing in discipleship. And in one church that we were a part of, they made a big deal of, nope, those life groups, that should be considered a front door environment as well. And so then all of a sudden you're completely robbed of that space that, where you are going deeper, you're growing in your faith, you're learning to bring your beliefs and everything in line with the authority of Scripture,
Mm-hmm.
because your neighbor is now there who's not a Christian yet. And so this winsome approach that you've been doing on Sunday morning,
Yeah.
goes all the way down into the small group, and you're not able to really grow in your discipleship. And I wonder if that's some of the reluctance to questioning this model and to, really meeting this cultural moment we're at, is that
Mm-hmm.
we've got an entire generation of people who have, were won to this model, who haven't really grown in their faith, and to be confronted with some of these things that you need to really change, your thinking or some of your beliefs on, these political issues, or, these other moral issues.
Mm-hmm.
Half of our churches would empty.
Yeah. Yeah, I do think that that's part of the threat, right? I mean, which was another question I know we were thinking discussing of like, why did this receive the response it did? And I do think that some people, if I'm right, which is a contestable claim, I'm open to that. I'm offering up an argument for discussion. If I'm right though, then a lot of people's ministries are going to have to radically change, right? And people don't like that. I mean, what's the famous quote I shared on Twitter a few weeks ago? But it's almost impossible to convince a man of something when, his job depends on him not being convinced by it, right?
Yeah.
And so there's that, and so I think that's part of the reason why it was met with the response. Again, if I'm right, which I might not be.
Yeah.
But the other thing is like, I two things. Yes, I mean, if you have an overly evangelistic approach to every facet of church life, you're gonna undercut discipleship in a certain way. And I understand the whole missional framework. I've been a part, because I'm already anticipating the critics I'm having. I've been a part of the missional community movements. I've been deep in that. I know how you try to integrate mission and discipleship together. Absolutely, I understand that. But if you are overly orienting yourself towards the non-Christian, it can go in these problematic directions where discipleship doesn't go deep enough, right? And we have tons of biblical illiteracy. We all know that. And also we're at a time of profound moral confusion. And I think this model often doesn't invite real moral clarity that people are really craving and needing right now.
Oh, especially, right now, I think that's this whole great awakening thing that we're seeing is
Yep.
in large part being fueled by
That's
this desire in the world that there's got to be more. This is, life is more than just consuming and watching, TV shows and chatting about them at work. There's more to it. And, we have that moral clarity that people are craving.
Yeah, for your audience, I would advise, if they don't already know this little book, it's a nice, very readable book called Power and Purity by Mark Mitchell, where he just talks about how the contemporary woke moment, he identified this pretty early. It was an early offering in the woke moment, is really a combination of two poles in America that don't seem really to go together, right? Which is kind of a moral absolutism and Nietzschean relativism. And so that's a really fascinating. So kind of anyway, and so but I think I think people, the Great Awakening is a fascinating thing to analyze sociologically for so many reasons. But one exactly that you're pinpointing here is like people are craving a thick moral vision that the public order should be framed by.
Yeah.
And people, and even intersecting with religious impulses, right? Confession and scapegoating and sin and guilt and all these things. I mean, people are craving that. And as a vacuum has emerged because Christianity has pulled back from that or been pushed out of it, an alternative post-Christian vision has entered the fray called wokeness. And so it's a fascinating thing. And so what does that mean for ministry? Well, I think it means we should be more bold and clear on a lot of these things without binding consciences unnecessarily or going beyond what we should say, but speaking the hard truths that people really do need to hear.
Yeah. Okay.
The famous quote, before I forget, is this really short. It's C.S. Lewis. I've shared it a couple times, but the hardness of God is kinder than the softness of men. And I think we need to really retrieve that kind of mindset. So.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so let's get practical. If we're going to meet this moment, how do we continue to follow the command to love our enemies while recognizing that there is a very wicked agenda that needs to be opposed? How do we kind of make those mesh?
Yeah. One more comment about Keller then on that front. And people have reckoned Keller's not hidden this. He's a registered Democrat, and he's made prudential reasons for that. And I think I can honor his intentions on that. But I also think it's just really interesting about I think a lot of what motivates Keller too, right, is how to get Democrats and Republicans to share the same pew and not hate each other. And I share that desire. But I also think that a lot of people who follow this model are still acting as if the Democratic Party is the same as it was in the 1990s. And I just think it isn't. The Republican Party, I shared how I did not vote in certain ways on my pieces. I'm not a card-carrying GOP person, rah, whatever. But I think we need to have a little bit clearer eyes on some of the forces animating the contemporary Democratic Party and be more honest about that. And so, okay, so how do we love our enemies? While even opposing some of their agendas. And Right. And I do think a thick understanding of love is needed. And so I made an argument, my second piece, of loving our neighbors through politics,
Hmm.
because pursuing justice and the common good is a way you love neighbor. But that love is not always received as love. And I think parents get this. If you're a parent,
Yep.
you know that your love is not always received as loving. And you have to be clear-minded enough and know your heart, but be clear-minded enough to know that, okay, I still need to do this. Right. So that's one thing. The other thing I mentioned in the spaces last night that I'm really starting to develop more with, especially my friend Daniel Strand, who's writing a book on this, is retrieving a political theology of the demonic. And I think that's really missing a lot of times in these third way winsome assessments of culture, a way of engaging the culture. Is It's still operating in the realm of ideas oftentimes. It's like, okay, we have this idea over here and this one over here. How do we either combine them or do something altogether different? Or we, have this value, but it can be really idealistic. And I think we need to actually retrieve much more a sense of there are demonic forces at play that are making people irrational, and we're not going to just engage them with reason. I don't think we give up on the pursuit of persuasion, but also realizing that that's there. But I said in the space last night, like, we need to recognize the demonic without demonizing other people. And so when I say this, I'm not saying the individuals who disagree with me are demons, but there's a spiritual battle at play here that can't be addressed purely through rational argument.
Yep, absolutely. And I think that's one thing that, the middle way, when Keller talks about that, there's this assumption that both sides there's honestly seeking the best. And if,
That's right,
the right gets this right, but the left gets this right. And, but they're both well-intentioned, and we need to kind of take and, pick and choose the best from both. And I think, there's too much evidence that there's just wickedness at play. And we need to recognize that there are evil forces that are, targeting the most vulnerable. And we have to, we have a duty to step up and, oppose the trans ideology and oppose abortion. And that's going to mean, I'm sorry, you can't vote for that, a higher tax rate because you think that's better. It's like, we got to figure out better, moral weight and scales to truly
the Keller model, oftentimes, like, I forget exactly how he phrases it, right? But it's like Christianity, what we're presenting is like how it fulfills and also, yes, subverts, but like the deepest longings of human persons. And so you try to like identify that and how their worldview or whatever doesn't actually, it's inconsistent, doesn't fulfill, and then kind of how Christianity answers that or whatever. But that, I think sometimes that's actually, on some things giving too much credit, right? Like there actually are some things that are evil, and there are evil forces at play that we just need to say, we need to call it out clearly. And so, for instance, around the abortion conversation right now, it is really interesting. One of the angles on it is, I do think some women have been tricked about what abortion is. And maybe they think it is just a clump of cells, and why is there a problem? Okay, so you do need to treat those people differently, I think. And guide them into the truth, though. But don't soft pedal it too much where you actually don't bring clarity. Because you're actually not only harming a baby, you're also harming that woman who's going to do something she will regret if you're not clear with her. And not also invite her to proper repentance if she's already done it, right? But then there are other people who very, and I think a lot of them who are very strong pro-choice people really do know what it is. And we've seen this right all the way up to 9 months, and even the recent conversations about even after birth. I mean,
just shout your abortion.
These people do know, and we need to say, no, that's evil for your own good. Even like you need to know that's evil, because I really hope I'm gonna do this in gentleness and respect so that you might repent. But like, I'm going to be clear enough for you to know that you need to repent. Right. So, and that's the tension, right? Like, yes, you need to do it gently and respectfully, inviting your opponents to repent, give them the space for that. But if you're not being clear enough to invite them to repentance, then you're actually doing them a disfavor as well.
Yep. Well, James, this has been just a great conversation. Thank you for starting this discourse a couple weeks ago. I think it's bearing much fruit, and I look forward to seeing where the conversation goes. Where can people find you?
Yes, I'm on Twitter, James R. Wood Theo 1, because there's a lot of people with my name. So you can find me there. I work at First Things right now. You can find my article there. But soon I will be. I'm taking on a faculty position at Redeemer University up in Canada. So if you're ever outside of Toronto, give me a ring and we'll grab a drink. So
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks. That's our show for today. Big thanks to James Wood for joining me on the show. If you have enjoyed this conversation, be sure to follow James on Twitter, where he's been really, furthering this conversation there. And he's a very sharp thinker, and I think you'd benefit a lot from following him. I'm there too, at Josh Dawes. I would love to know what you think about this episode or the podcast in general. Particularly whether or not you like these interview formats. I've had a ton of fun doing them, but I know it's a bit different than what we started the podcast with. So, let me know if you prefer that, the original format or the new format, or maybe a mix of the two. I'd love to, hear your ideas for future guests on the show, future, topics that we could discuss. So please, don't hesitate to reach out to me on Twitter. If you are listening on podcast, would really appreciate if you would give the show a rating on Apple Podcasts, preferably 5 stars if you're enjoying it. And a review there would help with visibility so we can get this content out to more people. Also, we do have a YouTube channel now. So if you're watching there, hit the subscribe button down below and turn on notifications so that you don't miss any upcoming episodes. So with that, remember, Romans 12:2 says, "Do not be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." So spend time in God's word and don't let the world conform you to its image. Until next time, we'll see you soon.